Welcome to Excel Campus. My name is John, and this is the second video in a three-part series on macros and VBA. In the last video, we wrote our first macro and learned about programming the objects in Excel. We also learned about how Andy's boss has been piling on the tasks. Andy knows he doesn't have time to complete all these projects manually, and it's worrying him a little bit. So in this video, we're going to help Andy automate one of these tasks. Every month he receives this workbook here that contains the sales reports for each rep within the organization, and he has to create this summary sheet here that lists all the sheets here, all the rep names or all the sheets in the workbook, and then these formulas point to each sheet in the workbook and basically bring in the year-to-date total sales. So he's creating this manually every month, and it's a lot of boring copy and paste, and it takes him quite a bit of time to do so. So we're going to write a macro that will do all this for him with just a click of a button. We're going to go ahead and start with the raw data file that Andy receives every month. Again, this is the file that contains all these sales reports. And so the first thing we're going to want to do is add that summary sheet to the front of it. I'm just going to hit Shift F11 on the keyboard. That'll add a sheet here, and I'm going to quickly rename it. Of course, we could do this with VBA as well, but I want to keep this example simple, so we'll just do this manually for now. So now I'm just going to hit Alt F11 to jump us into the VB editor. I've already saved this as a macro-enabled workbook, and I've also added Module 1 here. Now, if you don't see Module 1, the code window over here, you can just double-click on the module, and that'll open the code window right here. So with this macro, we basically want to list out all the sheets on the workbook on our summary sheet, and then also bring in those values, those year-to-date sales values. So we're going to go ahead and name this macro. We'll call it list sheets. And then typically, I'm going to again just hit the enter to end the sub there. And then typically at the top of my macros, I like to add a line of comment that basically describes the macro. So this is just going to list all sheets in the workbook. And basically any line, now if I hit enter here, you'll see that this line turns green, and that's because I started it with an apostrophe. So any line that you start with an apostrophe, basically that will comment out the line, and that means that this code will not run when we run the macro. So to list out all the sheets, we're going to need to use a for next loop. And before we get into how to use the for next loop, I want to discuss variables, because we're also going to be using variables in our for next loop. So basically a variable just allows us to store a number or text or an object in memory as the macro is running. So you might have seen this line of code, this dim statement at the top of a macro if you've copied some code off the web. And this dim statement just allows us to declare a variable. So you type dim, then a space, and then you type a name for your variable. This can be just about anything. In this case, I'm going to call it lcount, and then a space, as, and then space, and then here you'll see we get the IntelliSense, and this is a list of all the data types or the objects that we can declare as variables. In this case, I want lcount to hold a number. So to hold a number, we can use the long data type. This would be a variable type here, or a data type that we can use. So we're going to use the long variable type. This just holds a number, so I'll go ahead and hit enter. So now up here at the top of our code, we've just declared this variable lcount, and we can reuse this throughout our code. So for example, with our loop here, we're going to need to know how many sheets are in the workbook, and we can get that with the count property. So if I just type worksheets.count, that will return, basically that'll return the number of worksheets in the active workbook. This line will return the number of worksheets in the active workbook, but we also need to have a variable hold that number. So we're going to use lcount to do that. So basically we can just say lcount, we can put a space here, lcount equals, and then worksheets.count. So now when we run this line of code, I'll hit F8 to just step through my macro here. You can see right now if I hover over lcount, it currently equals 0. But after I run this line of code, lcount now equals 9. So it's basically counted all the sheets in the workbook. We can see if we hover there, there's 9 worksheets in the workbook, and lcount is now going to hold that number of sheets throughout the rest of the macro. So we can now use lcount down below in the rest of the macro as a variable that will hold that number. Okay, I'll just hit F8 again to end our sub, and now we're going to start typing the for next loop. So I'm going to need another variable for that. I'm just going to declare another variable. We're going to call this one lsheet, and we'll also use a long type variable. And again, this long holds a number. So just remember that, long holds a number. You can also put those comments at the end of lines like that. That won't run that line of code because it's commented out there. So now down here, we're going to start our for next loop with the word for. I'm just going to type the word for, and then we're going to reference our variable. In this case, we're going to loop through numbers. So we're going to use lsheet, and then we're going to say for lsheet equals 1 to lcount, which would be the total number of worksheets. I'm going to hit enter here, and then we'll just close our loop down here with the next line. So next lsheet. So we're basically going to use this loop to loop through all the sheets in the workbook and then list them out in our worksheet, in our summary sheet here. So what we want to do is I'll start typing within this loop here. We basically want to we'll start at cell A3 on our worksheet here and just list out our sheets all the way down column A. So we can start typing here range A3 dot, and then we're going to use the offset property. So offset will basically allow us to offset a certain number of rows. So if I open the parentheses here, you can see offset will allow us to specify a number of rows that we want to offset. And in this case, we're going to use lsheet. Well, I'll just copy lsheet. We're going to use lsheet here as the number of rows we want to offset, because again, this is going to basically increment or add 1 every time in the loop. And I'll explain more about this as we go through it. So we're going to offset that number of rows, and then we're going to say the value is going to be equal to, in this case, we're going to equal to the worksheet name. So worksheets, again, we're going to reuse our variable here, lsheet dot name. So this is basically going to loop through all the sheets in the workbook, because we're saying from 1 to 9, which would be the total number of worksheets, and then loop through and list them out in column A here. So let's go ahead and step through this and see how it works. So I'm going to hit F8 on the keyboard. That's going to jump us down. Again, right now, lcount equals 0. Hit F8 again. We'll see lcount equals 9. So now we're down here in our for next loop, and right now lsheet is 0. It's basically been declared, it's 0, and we're going to say that once we run this line of code, lsheet is first going to start with the number 1. So I'm going to hit F8. You'll see that lsheet is now equal to 1. So now in this line of code here, everywhere I'm referencing the variable lsheet, you can see lsheet is equal to 1. So that means this is going to start at A3, offset 1 row, and put the value equal to the worksheet name for the first worksheet in the workbook. So if I hit F8 now, you can see it's done that. It started at A3, went down 1 row, and then put the name of the first worksheet in the workbook right there. So now when we get to the next line here, basically when this next line is hit, it's just going to jump back to the line right underneath the for line. So I'll hit F8 again. You'll see it's basically looped back up here to the next line under the for line, and it's going to run this line again. And when we hit that next line, it also added 1 to lsheet. So now you can see if I hover lsheet equals 2, and we're basically going to offset 2 rows from range A3 and put the value of the worksheet, the second worksheet, worksheet 2, the name of that in that cell. So hit F8 again. You can see here's that worksheet name of sheet 2. If I move this over a little bit, you can see that's sheet 2 there. And you can continue to do that and just continue to hit F8, and you can see the names are being printed out here. So if I wanted to run that completely, I can just hit F5 on the keyboard or the run button here, and that'll just continue to run my macro and run it all the way out. And you can see all the sheets now in the workbook have been listed here in column A. So you can see how that's already going to save us a lot of time from either having to type out these sheet names or copy and paste them every month. Now the next thing we want to do in our summary sheet here, I'm going to make this column a little wider, is we want to bring in a value from each sheet. So we want to bring in the year-to-date total, which would be this number here. And basically what the boss wants is he just wants a formula that just points to that cell in the worksheet. So I'll just type an equal sign, go over to Andrew's worksheet here, and select cell D10 and then hit enter. And now I have a formula here. This formula is just pointing to cell D10 on that sheet. So we can also have VBA create these formulas for us. So I'm just going to copy this formula out. That way I won't have to type it. I'm going to hit Control C on the keyboard, copy that, and then I'll hit Alt F11 to jump back into the VB editor. And now basically what we want to do is we want to write that formula, or have VBA write that formula in column B. So I can do that. I'm going to just paste that down here temporarily. I can then copy and paste this line here so I don't have to retype it. And I'm still going to offset one row throughout my loop here, but I also want to offset one column to the right. So I can put a comma here, and you'll see that there's also an argument here for a column offset with the offset property. And if I just put a 1 there, that'll now offset one column to the right. So we're going to start at A3, go down a certain number of rows, and one column to the right would then be column B. So we'll say that value, and instead of the value, we're actually going to use a formula. So dot formula will be the property that we're going to set, and that's going to be equal to, and then basically it's going to be equal to this formula right here. So I'm going to copy this again, and basically when we're putting a formula in, we put it in double quotes, just like as if it's text. So I'll put it in double quotes like that. I'm also going to get rid of this line here to delete a line. Control Y on the keyboard will delete a line. So now we have our formula, and as you can see, obviously this is going to input this formula, but it would input the same formula every time, and we don't want that. We want, for every time in our loop, we want to actually put the reference, the worksheet name of the sheet name we're on within the loop. So we can just reuse this line of code here that's going to return the worksheet name, and we can replace that with Andrew's name here. So in order to do that, I'm first going to basically, I'll just add space here so you can kind of see this. So I want to wrap this in double quotes, and then I'm going to use the ampersand symbol to kind of concatenate or join this line. Let me move over a little bit here. And then we're going to paste the worksheet name right here. And again, we'll put the ampersand and then the quote. So now basically this line, when it evaluates, it's just going to return that formula. It's kind of funky looking, but hopefully you can understand that it's just going to basically put that formula in there, the equal sign, then the worksheet name of the sheet we're on in the loop, and then cell D10 right there. So let's go ahead and try this out and see if it works. So again, I'm going to hit F8 on the keyboard to start stepping through our code here. I'm going to step through the loop, and basically now that will have put Andrew's name, or I'm sorry, that'll put summary here in B4. That's going to have a link, a formula to the summary sheet, which isn't too useful. We'll get rid of that a little later. I'll step through this again. That's put the formula here. I'll step through it one more time, and you can see now we have our new formula that'll point to this sheet for Ann Larson. So you can see the formula has been entered right there. It's a dynamic formula that's being built here with this line of code as we're looping through all the sheets in the workbook. So again, I'm just going to go ahead and hit F5 to complete this macro, and you can see, sure enough, all of our formulas now have been listed here. You could see them up here as well. Basically, all the formulas are put in there properly and pointing to each sheet in the workbook. And that runs almost instantly. So again, this is going to save us a lot of time from having to point formulas to each sheet in the workbook. You could also use the indirect function to do this in Excel. That would be another approach as well. But for this example, we're going to use the macro. All right, so our summary report's starting to take shape. Now, the other nice feature that we want to add is hyperlinks to each sheet. So in column A here, where the sheet name is, I want to put a hyperlink to each sheet. So it makes it really easy to navigate through this workbook. And we can do that in VBA as well. So I'm going to hit Alt F11 on the keyboard, bring up the VB editor again. And one other good thing to note is there is a save button here in the VB editor as well. So if you're working on your code and you want to save it, you can click the save button or Control S. That'll just save your workbook. So now I basically, within our loop here, I'm going to add another line of code, and I'm going to add this line of code in that will add the hyperlink. Now, I previously recorded a macro to get this code. I'm going to copy and paste it in, and I'll just walk through what it means. So I'm going to paste this line of code in here. Let me move the VB editor over a little bit so you can see it. So basically, this line of code here will add a hyperlink, and it's going to add a hyperlink to the range. So in this case, it's going to add a hyperlink to the range that we're specifying in the loop here using the offset. And then the sub address will add the link to that specific sheet and a cell within that sheet. So this is just going to add a hyperlink that'll link to each sheet and cell A3 within those sheets. So again, I used the macro recorder to get this by just creating a hyperlink. The macro recorder is a great way to get code, so don't discount it. Even though we're learning to write code, you can still use the macro recorder to get code. It's a great tool for that. The macro recorder won't do things like loops and some of these more advanced programming techniques, so you're not going to see that with the macro recorder, but you can use it to get little snippets of code. All right, so let's go ahead and test this out now and see how it works. Again, I'm going to hit F8 on the keyboard to just kind of start stepping through this. You'll see when we get to this line here, we're basically going to add that link, and you can see cell A4 over here has this link that's been added to it, and so I'm going to keep stepping through. Now Andrew has a link as well. And so I'll just hit F5 on the keyboard to run this completely, and you can see hyperlinks have been added here to my summary sheet. And this is a great feature. Your boss will love this, I guarantee it, because it makes it so much easier to navigate through your workbook. You can just click on a person's name here. That'll take you right to their summary sheet or their sales report, basically, and then it makes it very easy to navigate through the workbook. To make it even easier to navigate, you'll see that we have the link to the summary sheet here, which is not useful at all on this sheet, but we can actually put this link on all of the other sheets. So if I just hit Control C right now to copy, that's going to copy this cell here, and now I just want to select all the other sheets in the workbook. So I'm going to select Andrew's sheet here, Control and then hit that to go to the end, hold down the Shift key. That'll select all the sheets here. And now I'm just going to paste that in cell A3. Cell A3 is blank, so I'm going to hit Control V to paste. And now within all of the sheets in our workbook here, we have a link back to the summary sheet. So I just click this, that'll jump us back to the summary sheet. If I want to see some details on Michael's sales, I can jump to his sheet, check out his report, jump back to the summary sheet. So as you can see, this makes it really easy to navigate through this workbook now, and it allows the boss to do that without having to navigate through sheets down here, especially if your workbook has 20, 30, or even 100 sheets in it. This will make it really easy to navigate. Now there's a few other lines of code that we need to add to our macro here. So I'm going to bring the VB editor back up, and really important lines of code. As I mentioned in the previous video about fully qualified references, basically right now this macro is just going to run on the active sheet and the active workbook. So if we were to accidentally run this when we have another sheet selected, like if I had this sheet selected here and I run my macro, well, that's going to add all those sheet names to column A and totally ruin this report here. So we don't want to do that, and we want to be careful that we don't accidentally run it on another sheet. And so one way to do that is we can just actually add lines of code here to the top of the workbook that'll do that for us. I'm sorry, top of the macro. So right up here below the dimensions, or I'm sorry, the variables that I'm declaring, I'm first going to use the this workbook property. And this workbook will just basically refer to the workbook that we're currently in, this workbook that contains the code. And so if I hit a dot after that, you'll see the properties and methods. And basically we want to use the activate method here. So the activate method will just activate this workbook. So if we have another workbook active and we don't really realize that before we run this macro, this will make sure that it first activates this workbook. And then we also want to activate our summary sheet, or we want to select our summary sheet, so we make sure we're on our summary sheet before we print out all these values. So we can do that just by referencing the worksheet and call it summary, just like this, double quotes there, dot select. That'll basically select our summary sheet. So we've seen how we can quickly create this summary sheet with just a few lines of code here in this macro. Of course, we'd want to clean this up a little more, maybe add a title up here, a subtotal at the bottom, and format it. But all in all, we have a nice looking summary sheet now that we can just create with the click of a button. Of course, you might want to automate this further, and I'd love to know if you have any questions. So you can leave a question with what you'd like to automate in the comments below. So in the next video, we're going to build this user form that will allow us to export sheets to individual files. And as you can see, Andy is very excited about it. Again, please leave a comment below with any questions or suggestions for the Summary Sheets macro. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you soon.